Hi, I'm Michael Hanna. I'm the U.S. Program Director at Crisis Group, and I'm glad to have all of you with us today. As part of our work around the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we did a variety of research, and one of the key pieces of that was a report that we put out called Overkill: Reforming the Legal Basis for the U.S. War on Terror. And that report really sought to chart out the executive branch's expansion of the use of military force over the last 2 decades. And we've brought this panel together today, and it's co-hosted, I should add, with Just Security and the Reese Center on Law and Security, where I'm also a non-resident senior fellow, as is Tess. And so it's a really great opportunity to bring this really distinguished group of national security law and national security experts together to talk about the report and reflections about its findings. I should add that after we have our own moderated discussion, we're going to move to questions, and you and our attendees will be able to pose questions to the panel. A little bit different for Crisis Group, I should note that today this event has been approved for 1 credit hour in the areas of professional practice category for New York State CLE credit, which when I was actually a sitting member of the bar as opposed to a retired member of the bar, was a great inducement to attendance at such events. So a nice bonus. So to talk about this report, I'm joined by a really amazing panel. I'm glad we could put this together. And I'm going to give you just quick bios before we go to the discussion. So Tess Bridgeman is the co-editor-in-chief of Just Security, and she served in the White House as special assistant to the president, associate counsel to the president, and deputy legal advisor to the NSC during the Obama administration. Lieutenant Colonel John Cherry, who was until very recently a U.S. Marine Corps judge advocate, and is currently an institutional capacity building attorney at the Defense Institute of International Legal Studies, and is joining a public event, I think, as a civilian for the first time. So we're really honored to have you join us today. Loren DeJonge Schulman, who's an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. And most recently, she served as the senior advisor for the National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, and served in a variety of NSC and DoD positions before that. And it's good to have a non-lawyer amongst us as well. And then finally, Brian Finucane, who's a senior advisor at the U.S. program at Crisis Group, and was the lead researcher and lead author on this report. Before he joined us, he worked for a decade in the Office of Legal Advisor at the State Department. And I should just note that the U.S. program at Crisis Group, which I joined in May and Brian joined shortly thereafter in June, has been reconfigured and expanded, and we were really happy that this report reflected the kind of first major output of the work that we are going to be undertaking. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Brian, who I really commend this report to all of you. For those who haven't read it, really offers an amazing sort of forensic examination of both the bottom up, the top down and bottom up expansion of this use of military force over the past 20 years. So I'll turn it over to Brian, and he can offer us some thoughts about what went into this report, the reasons he wrote it, and I think maybe some of the key takeaways, and then we'll turn to our other panelists to address various aspects of that.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to Loren and Tess and John for joining us today, as well as everybody who's tuning in from wherever they might be. As you said, the report charts the expansion in the last 2 decades of the U.S. war on terror, and the story it tells is in large part a story of legal interpretations within the U.S. executive branch and how those legal interpretations expanded and stretched the scope of the war on terror and the use of military force for counterterrorism purposes. And in large part, these are interpretations of the foundational war authorization underpinning the war on terror, the 2001 authorization for the use of military force passed in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And over the past 2 decades, the executive branch has interpreted this war authorization to allow it to use force against new groups and new countries, at least a dozen. In many circumstances, it's hard to see what the connection between these uses of force is and the attacks of 9/11. So for one prominent example of these creative interpretations that have expanded the scope of the war is this concept of associated forces, which we discuss in the report. This is a term that doesn't appear in the text of the war authorization, but was developed by the executive branch to provide legal justification for the detention of various Islamist militants at Guantanamo Bay who'd been captured in the battlefield, primarily in Afghanistan. And while they might be militants, they weren't necessarily members of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. And so after they'd been captured and detained, the executive branch had to come up with a legal justification, legal basis for their detention. And hence the concept of associated forces was developed over time. And then later repurposed outside the context of detention, in the context of targeting. And so, for example, in 2016, the Obama administration declared that Al-Shabaab as a whole was an associated force, and suddenly the U.S. was at war with Al-Shabaab. And so these legal innovations were repurposed over time to further stretch the scope of this conflict. And as you mentioned, it's been both a top-down process. So, for example, in 2014, the Obama administration decided to wage war against ISIS in Iraq, first in Iraq and Syria, and later shoehorned them under the authorization of use of military force, but also bottom-up process. U.S. special operators deployed in Africa on ostensibly non-combat advised assistant company operations often found themselves involved in combat, including in Somalia and Niger. And so where we find ourselves today is the Biden administration is overseeing a policy review with respect to direct action, that is capture or kill operations for counterterrorism. But it seems to be limited to the mechanics of direct action, rather than addressing more fundamental questions of counterterrorism policy, of whether we should be undertaking use of military force for counterterrorism at all, and if so, where and against whom. So 20 years into the war on terror, there needs to be a fundamental reckoning between the executive branch, Congress, and the American public about whether military force remains a necessary counterterrorism tool, and if so, against whom and where. And so that turns to our recommendations, which are that the Biden administration is really seriously engaged with Congress on reforming the war authorization, the 2001 AOMF, and to a minimum that would involve specifying against whom force would be used, where force may be used, and imposing a 2 to 3 year sunset on the authorization, after which Congress would have to reauthorize use of force. And this sort of conversation is necessary to really grapple with the fundamental questions of whether military force remains a necessary counterterrorism tool.
Brian, I guess one of the things raised by the recommendations of this report is the kind of separation of power and the necessary oversight that should be part of the kind of war-making function. And the report accords a kind of primary role for Congress in this. And of course, this raises some questions, I'm sure for others, whether this is a role that Congress can fulfill competently, whether enhanced congressional oversight, in fact, would make a difference. I mean, part of why we are thinking about these issues is concern about the trajectory of this conflict over 20 years. Would the quality of oversight improve? Would the sort of quality of decision making in terms of direct action and war making? Would it improve if Congress had a more enhanced role and took more responsibility for those kinds of decisions?
So I don't harbor any illusions about Congress and its various shortcomings, but I would say that in the first instance, the Constitution itself assigns a primary role for Congress in deciding against whom and where the United States wages war. It's Congress that has power to declare war. But more broadly, I think the quality of decision-making would benefit from public discussion, public deliberation, and involving a wider group of people, both in Congress and the American public, in these decisions about where force is to be used. It is anomalous that a dozen dudes in a SCIF, or the Secure Compartment Information Facility, can decide where and against whom the United States will use military force or go to war. Those have traditionally been decisions taken by Congress. So that is where I think the fundamental questions about whether counterterrorism needs military force should be addressed in the public discussion involving Congress, the executive branch, and the American public.
Thanks. Tess, maybe I'll turn to you. And one of the things that is cataloged in the report is the role of the executive branch lawyers and executive branch lawyering in this expansion of the use of force. And I guess having been one of those executive branch lawyers, I'll pose the question to you as to whether you think that focus is warranted. Are executive branch lawyers compelled to reach a conclusion? Are they lawyering to an outcome? Or do they in fact create a constraint? Is this a real barrier to potentially more expansive action? Or is this more of a pro forma kind of function?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, thanks for this report to those of you at Crisis Group. It's a phenomenal collection of pulling together a lot of threads that really need attention today. And on the specific question, Michael, that you're raising about lawyering and the role of law and whether executive branch lawyers can act as a constraint, I think this report clearly shows several ways in which they did not, in which they helped policymakers to expand the AUMF over time. But I do want to start by saying, in many of the cases where law does act as a constraint, the public never sees it because something didn't happen, right? Or because a classified proposal came across the transom and never was seen again. There are other kind of more public ways, law acts as a constraint in terms of what funding authorities can be used to do what, whether DOD has been authorized by Congress to do X or Y in the NDAA or other statutes, those kinds of things, those kind of bread and butter domestic lawyering questions. I think you often get law really acting as a hard constraint on executive branch action. And I'd also want to preface by saying, and the report gets at this really clearly, that the lawyers are not a monolithic group and are trained sometimes in different ways to have different considerations in mind when questions are asked of them. So if you're a DOJ litigator, you are very likely trained to preserve discretion almost at all costs. That to me is a policy choice. It's a values choice to elevate discretion and not wanting to concede error, as the report notes, above other kinds of values. And it's one that is in tension, I think, with how some other executive branch lawyers approach questions. So, one place where Brian Finucane and I both practiced is the State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor, where most of us were trained as international lawyers and had to think about, in the first instance, things like reciprocity, things like what are other states going to say and do in response to the actions the US takes. And those kinds of questions can tend to lead to a different mode of lawyering that doesn't just look at how do we get to yes and how do we preserve discretion. I'm obviously caricaturing a little bit here, something that's much more complicated, but just to kind of lay out some outer parameters. But I do think that the report was right to note that there are some significant ways in which creative legal interpretations expanded the AUMF and expanded the so-called war on terror in ways that were incredibly pernicious over time. So we saw the associated forces innovation that Brian mentioned, the later successor forces innovation applied to ISIL. We saw things like, and I think this is referenced in the report as well, the idea that there is a detention authority for those who provide substantial support to Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. It's not even clear what that meant at the time that it was included in the Obama administration's March 13th, 2009 brief. There are other concepts as well that it wasn't clear what the content of the law was at the time that a legal standard was announced, right? And that, I think, the idea that we can fill in the details later and be flexible, but we've reached kind of a lowest common denominator of being willing to say yes, even if it's for different reasons. I think we saw plenty of that over the last 20 years. What that means, I think, stepping back, there's kind of two big questions. One, and Rebecca Ingber has written recently about this, and I commend you to her piece in Just Security about it. Lawyers don't wake up in the morning and say, what law can I interpret today, right? They're asked questions by policymakers in order to undertake certain operations or, take actions with partners, whatever the case may be. And the question of whether it is legally available to do something and whether we should do it, which Brian just alluded to, is an important one not to get lost in this discussion, right? So the idea that we can, say, apply the AUMF per executive branch past practice to Boko Haram, does that mean we should open a new front in the global war on terror in Nigeria? That's a different question, right? And one that needs to be weighed regardless of what the legal answer is. But the other one is something that's been addressed at length in lots of other forums, but I think is important to bring it back around again, is this question of, should lawyers be looking at what's legally available or offering the best view of the law? Should lawyers be more willing to say, I could get you there in a non-frivolous, non-Rule 11 sanctionable argument, but it's not one I'm comfortable making because it's not one that is in line with the values of the United States of America, and it's not one that in our long-term interests is going to be advantageous even to us or our allies if we advance those legal arguments. So I think a kind of rethink in some of the key offices and from the very top about whether getting to yes and finding a legally available approach is the right culture and is the right kind of mode to be thinking in is an important one. But last caveat, I don't want to oversimplify, right? Look, the lawyers are trying to work with policymakers to do what they think is in the best interest of the United States. And in different legal offices, there are different cultures that do that in different ways. But it's I think this question of, are we looking at the long-term interests of the United States? Are we looking at reciprocity? Are we looking at the ways in which partners and other nations or even non-state armed groups will use these legal interpretations? I think those questions need to be more front of mind.
Tess, could I just quickly follow up on, for the benefit of the non-lawyers listening, but legally available is an important concept here. And so maybe just a brief explanation of what that means. And then and my question really is, is this, how does this change? Is this an attitudinal change? Is this a doctrinal change that needs to happen? What needs to happen for this to, for there to be restraint around the use of this concept, which has proved in practice to be fairly expansive in its application?
Right. I will say that it's a two-way street here. And often when lawyers say something is legal available, which I encourage John or Brian to pipe up here as well, but what's generally meant by that is an argument can be made, even if it's not the best argument, even if it's not a terribly good argument. There is room within the law if we, if we read it this way or rely on a certain precedent, even if it was an outlier, it would be not beyond the pale, essentially. It is legally available to get to a certain conclusion. When lawyers offer that advice, there are lots of different ways of doing it. And often it's offered in a way that policymakers do know the lawyers don't think it's the best interpretation of the law, right? So I would say part of that needs to be put back on the policymakers is, are you always going to choose the course that is a little bit dangerous in terms of whether that's a precedent we want to set just because the lawyers, have enabled it, so to speak. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And that's also something I wouldn't want to caricature in this discussion. I think plenty of policymakers are really savvy about not wanting to race to that, lowest common denominator. But the other piece of it that I think you're talking about, is it culture? Is it a bottom up or top down phenomenon? It partly is where the question comes in to the executive branch. It's always going to be harder, I think, in litigation for lawyers to want to, close off that discretion. But I think DOJ can do it. And I think they should do it more often. There have been a few cases where the US conceded habeas cases of Guantanamo detainees without even saying why necessarily, but clearly the legal authority and the arguments that would have to be made to defend holding a particular detainee were not ones that the United States felt comfortable making. That is a valid decision. So I think it's important that lawyers feel empowered to make those choices and to vindicate values other than preserving discretion. Preserving discretion is an important one. It's a big part of the lawyer's role, but it's not the only value. And I think that tone does have to come from the top down.
So, Colonel Cherry, shifting from the top-down environment, the other pressure that Brian ably catalogs in this report is what happens bottom up. And often what begins as a non-combat deployment that effectively ends up in combat operations. And I guess, one question raised by that is it realistic in many of these instances to imagine that these deployments will remain non-combat? And if it's not, what does that tell us about the nature of authorizations for these deployments? And existing oversight, because this pressure has obviously manifested itself in ways in which non-combat forces end up, not inevitably, but often enough to where we have to, it raises the question about the fundamental nature of some of these deployments.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that, and obviously thanks to Crisis Group for being here, my first ever civilian act. After my retirement, I would say, in the military world, we often experience, Michael, what you kind of talked about there, from how the mission evolves bottom up. We call it mission creep, and that can occur in domestic operations overseas, like humanitarian assistance or disaster relief. In combat operations, obviously specifically to what the report talks about, and the term mission creep often comes with a negative connotation, but fortunately, the mission evolves, right? The mission changes, and that mission creep is a necessary byproduct to the operation. The facts on the ground and what that specific situation requires to complete that mission. Sometimes that mission begins as an advise and assist. Specifically, we talked about. Africa and I think Somalia is a great example in what we've seen there. And sometimes, we have military forces on the ground who are there to advise and assist. But that mission changes. The facts on the ground change, and it requires them to change what their role is. I think, Tess brought up a great point about the law's role and how sometimes the public doesn't see the role the law plays. And the law often stops the expansion of that mission. Could we get there legally? Sure, we could. Tess asked, Brian and I wanted to weigh in a little bit. We often say it's lawful but awful. In other words, yeah, you could do that. In my role as a military attorney, sir, ma'am, you could do that. But is that the best choice? And here's why. And that's where the lawyer in the government world goes from being just that legal expert to an overall advisor, to the commander or to the policy expert. So my role as a military attorney, and now in my new role at DILS as a civilian government attorney, is to focus on the law, obviously, and advising my client. And that client can change. And my client has been from the strategic level, at the joint staff, to the operational level, to the tactical level. And I think it's important that we look at the strategic and tactical legal considerations in a place like Africa and as the report expertly highlights, specifically with al-Shabaab, and, what's our domestic legal basis to use force? What's our international legal basis? And then once we're there and we have troops on the ground, what are our law of armed conflict, IHL considerations, and does that, mission creep, or I think more accurately, that change in mission, how does it impact those bases? And I think it's really important that we look at that through a practical lens. And I think in the report, some really great points are made with specific facts about the different situations, and also the legal and policy decisions that were made to get there. But I think regardless of legal or policy constraints, the mission is going to be dictated by the conditions on the ground. And, as we say, the enemy gets a vote. And we need to ensure our forces have the operational flexibility provided under legal and policy constraints in order to adapt to those changing conditions and then complete the mission, whether it's the mission initially intended by the operation or the mission that has evolved as operations change.
Just by way of follow-up, I guess, we talked about the culture of lawyering. I wonder as well with advise and assist missions, deploying special forces operators, is there also a kind of a cultural bias, so to speak, institutionally in terms of wanting to engage in combat? I mean, this is what these kinds of forces are trained for. And so when put in those circumstances that are, where, yes, flexibility is desired, but is there a bias toward action in those situations that might, tip the decision-making in terms of whether to engage in kinetic operations?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I am sure in the military, like in any profession, we have some very gung-ho operators out there who are looking for action. But I think for the most part, all of our military members are professionals first and foremost, and they're going to fall back to their training, their guidance, their rules of engagement, or maybe the rules of use of force, depending on the situation. And I think they're going to stay within those constraints for the most part. I'm confident that I've seen it happen. I will also say that there are times when the situation on the ground requires them to go beyond what the intended mission was they thought was going to happen. The facts on the ground can change very dynamically, and as we know, and I think Brian alluded to, sometimes Congress isn't as dynamic as one would hope in changing and evolving. And so, sometimes, those forces on the ground have to make split-second decisions to either, protect those forces around them or often to protect themselves. And so I think sometimes what we see, what we consider a bias for action, is more just a necessity to act based on the facts on the ground.
Loren, some of the recommendations coming out of this report relate to legal reform, and particularly in terms of the AUMF and the role of Congress. But turning to the non-lawyer, I wonder if you have thoughts about, I know you've given this some thought in the past, but things that Congress and DOD could do short of legal reform. We know the hurdles to legal reform and why that's difficult. There is new momentum for that kind of reform now, and we've seen draft legislation submitted, and so this is a live issue. But setting that aside as perhaps a parallel track, are there things that can happen short of that kind of systemic reform that could also play a factor in creating a healthier approach to these kinds of operations?
Thanks so much, Michael. Let me first state up front that I am a huge fan of the recommendations in the report around what legal reform is necessary, both on the congressional side in terms of how they provide oversight, as well as on the executive branch side. And if I could flip a switch tomorrow and have those in place, I would absolutely do so. But as you see on the Twitters, we live in a society, and not everything can be perfect the way that we would like. Sometimes I feel like the fixation on the legal reform, the war powers and AUMF reform avoids the issue that war is not just about initiation. It's about a long buildup that has a lot of factors that go into it and a lot of operational decisions that go on throughout the context of combat, to include how to actually conclude those operations over time. And Congress has and can have a role in all of those. And when we talk about war powers reform, AUMF reform, and other things, by honing in on congressional war powers just in those narrow moments, we're avoiding moments where Congress can have a positive influence on the conduct of operations, on providing oversight and translation to the American people, and influence on the executive branch and how they actually conduct themselves. So I have worked closely with Richard Fontaine at CNAS to look at what are some of those things that Congress can and should be doing that acknowledges that long role of Congress from end to end in combat, not just on this point of war initiation. I think that a couple of key limitations to acknowledge on this, though, is that there's a lot of diffusion of war-making powers in Congress now. If you look at, just by reading the law, if you look at just the Foreign Affairs and Foreign Relations committees, they're designated in war powers, but they really have very little access, information, control, hearing, and oversight authority that relates to the conduct of combat operations, what goes before the decision and what comes after. And so much of the other authority that would come with that, so the oversight authority would come with that, is dispersed across the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs and Foreign Relations Committee, the committees that oversee overseas bases, the intelligence communities, and so on. And let's be honest, they don't all like to work together terribly well. So this would require them to change how they approach their roles and not be quite so territorial. But we've seen in the past Congress actually have influence in a lot of ways, positive ways, around military operations in, I would say, probably 3 different buckets. The first is around the collecting and sharing of information. The president has a ton of advantages in this. He's got the entire executive branch to be able to tell him, here's what's going on the ground, and allow him to present the narrative of, here's my view of the situation, the threats, the challenges that we expect to have, our allies, and so on. Congress has a lot of tools to be able to collect and share the same, and also bring in alternative viewpoints that the president may not want to put forward, whether this be through hearings, which is a great way to grab the bully pulpit, briefings, congressional delegations, expert consultations, investigations, when they develop their own reports, letters, meetings with foreign officials, and any number of other things. And they do these things, but they don't think of them as an overall campaign that they can execute of influencing how the public is seeing this facts on the ground, whether it be in Yemen or Afghanistan or otherwise. There's been some real masters of this in the past. John McCain was great at this, but others have not quite have followed up in his shoes. I would say the second bucket is probably more in injecting ideas into the decision process. The Iraq surge, whether you be a fan of it or not, much of the influence of that, much of the intellectual thought behind it, and much of the public support of it came from Congress, not from the executive branch, and not even necessarily from the military, as you saw members of Congress trying to lift up the ideas that Petraeus and others were putting forward and thinking about how we might execute that on the ground. Formal statements, public speaking, op-eds, these are all things that, again, members do, but they don't think of them or connect them in ways that would allow them to have an influence on that public space and the private decision-making of the president. And then the last 2 categories I would say is Congress needs to do more to think about its own oversight capacity. Going back to my point about not sharing information, not sharing portfolios amongst committees. Congressional capacity and staffing has been in a crisis for at least 2 decades or more. We just laugh it off as something that, like, this is okay. We'll just accept that we pay people who are overseeing our military operations $25K a year. This is not actually an acceptable thing. We need to treat it as such. And I was really happy to see Congress wake up and decide to authorize more pay increases for its staff. But streamlining jurisdictions is always going to be a tough nugget to actually formally do. I think this is more progress to be made behind the scenes. And then lastly, I would say, this is a final piece of that, building trust and relationships amongst congressional staff and committees, but also with their jurisdictional partners, Department of Defense and state and the intelligence community. There's a lot of oversight activity that assumes on its face that these are adversarial relationships. And there's so much more that could be done if they were not presumed from the get-go of being so. And we see models of that in other countries that we can learn from a lot. So I'll pause there.
So let me just quickly follow up on the politics of this. I mean, these are live, oftentimes incredibly fraught political questions, and obviously bringing Congress into more intimately into these kinds of decisions faces real political challenges. So I wonder if you could touch a little bit on that.
There's a general assumption, I think, that there is no political upside to a member of Congress engaging either on a particular use of force decision or on war powers overall, that like this is something to be avoided. Let the, at least publicly, to the degree that they're wanting to have influence, do so behind the scenes. I think particularly we've seen many examples in the past, but also in the last couple of years of counterexamples of this, where members of Congress have formed coalitions that are outside the bounds of their political party or across a spectrum within their own party to be able to make progress on Yemen, on Saudi Arabia, as they make progress, like have actual policy influence around Yemen, around Saudi Arabia, around Afghanistan, and otherwise. And in doing so, they have not yet experienced the political blowback that I think we anticipate coming from standing up and requesting the executive branch take another direction, share more information, or otherwise. I think there's interesting coalitions to be found here. You saw this among Yemen a few years ago, amongst the anti-war coalition around people who are in favor of international restraint in use of force and international restraint in American actions overseas. People who are really in favor of reasserting congressional power based on their constitutional authorities. They might have been supportive of military intervention, but they just wanted Congress more to be a part of it. And then also people who are just deeply interested in the outcomes, the humanitarian outcomes we were seeing on the ground. Those are not national bedfellows on a normal day, but they've found the ability to work behind the scenes through a coalition of outside advocates and nonprofits to be able to pass legislation together. I think there's lots of opportunity for more action like that.
Thanks. And so before we open the floor up to Q&A from all our attendees, we'll circle back to our CLE credit, and we're going to pause here. The course code is RCLS 4277. So all those who are seeking CLE credit need to record this code and submit them on an attorney affirmation form, which you'll be able to find in the chat. And just to note that this event is appropriate for both newly admitted and experienced attorneys. So with that, I'm gonna start going through the questions submitted by our attendees. And of course, it's only fair that the first one goes to Rachel Goldbrenner from the Reese Center. And Rachel's question is the use of force automatically each time the conduct of war? How do you distinguish between war and some lesser characterization of the use of force? What do you suggest the US policymaking structure be in order to deal with extremist terrorist groups using violence to destabilize countries around the world? So I will turn that first question back to whoever on the panel would like to address that.
I can take an initial stab at that, knowing that I've got brilliant colleagues who probably have other different perspectives. But on the whether or not a use of force is automatically war, I think you need to be looking at what the context is. Within the U.S. domestic legal context, the executive branch has distinguished between war in the constitutional sense and lesser uses of force. And under the prevailing doctrine within the executive branch, the president has some authority to use force short of war in the constitutional sense. And the executive branch draws these distinctions based on the nature, scope, and duration of any anticipated use of force. And in terms of how do we structure decision-making about using military force to respond to violent extremist groups, I think this is gets back to one of the recommendations in the report, where there needs to be a reckoning between the executive branch, Congress, and the public about what are the best tools to defend the United States from the threat of terrorist violence. Is military force still a necessary tool? We've had 20 years to develop an entire suite and range of defensive tools to protect the United States. And so there's a real question about what extent military force remains a necessary counterterrorism tool.
Michael, can I add to that a bit? And I'll let Tess do some lawyering after. One of the things that I loved in this report and some other research that I've done is that talks about that really fuzzy line between when US forces are overseas supporting combat operations and when they're actually involved in combat operations themselves. There's some quote from my own research, and it's echoed in Brian's as well, that even if we can actually identify that line between supporting combat and involvement in combat, how much control does anyone really have over crossing it? So I think the lawyering question is a really interesting one, but the actual facts on the ground one, and whether or not members of Congress, the American public, or even folks in the Department of Defense and the Pentagon really understand how little control we have over that. I think that's a huge question and one that deserves a lot more exploration. Brian goes into this, and I've done a bit of research on this too. There's the great example of the Tango Tango incident in Niger, where members of Congress said, I didn't know we had troops in Congress in Niger. I had no idea that we had people there at all. And they've been briefed on it any number of times, but had never or rarely been briefed in the context of US forces are at risk there. US forces are in combat operations there. That's not how it was framed. It's framed in a much more kind of benign context. So there's a lot of language issues that are associated with this on top of the legal ones that influence, I think, both policymaker perceptions, as well as the American public.
Yeah, I'll just add one point onto that directly builds off what you just noted, Loren, about that fuzzy line and when it's crossed. That's exactly why Congress in the 1973 War Powers Resolution used the term hostilities and intended it to be broad, rather than saying use of, initiation of war or, starting of war in the constitutional sense, as Brian describes it, which is actually, DOJ speak for what's reserved to Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. And this idea that even, deploying combat equipped troops abroad is something Congress needs to be notified of. The idea that a substantial enlargement of that kind of contingent once deployed is something Congress needs to be notified of quickly, within 48 hours. And the idea that hostilities, which includes situations short of exchanges of fire, and imminent risks of hostilities, right? These are all things that the War Powers Resolution speaks of and requires Congress to be put on notice of for exactly that reason. As we all know, and those who've read this report know, the resolution has been read much more narrowly by the executive branch. So there's a lot that Congress either isn't being put on notice of or doesn't have those tools in the resolution to be able to actually terminate or wrap up because of executive branch interpretations, among other reasons we don't need to get into. But it's policing that line that was exactly what was on Congress's mind, and is a really big reason why we need war powers reform now. But at the same time, the executive branch could always, of its own accord, choose not to get itself in those kinds of situations. And that's, again, just wanting to be careful to distinguish between when it has to be a legal question, but when there's also a deeper policy question lurking in the background of should we or must we if it's coming to the use of force.
Yeah, Tess, I think that's a great point. And I also think that it's important to note that our troops on the ground, they are sometimes severely constrained when they can use force, sometimes with the rules of engagement, sometimes with the tactical directive. But I think there's an impression that anytime we have troops overseas with weapons that they can use force, but unless we are engaged in hostilities or in some kind of armed conflict, our troops then can only use force typically in self-defense, which is kind of different, obviously different than the ad bellum self-defense that we often talk about, but truly in a situation like a police officer, right, where there's threat of death or bodily injury, and then they can use force, but that's outside of a situation of armed conflict or something not related to the conflict.
Great. I should note, I jumped the gun. It was not Rachel Goldbrenner, it was Ronald Goldbrenner. So maybe a relation, but not Rachel herself that asked the question. Yeah, turning to some of the other questions that have been posed, and please feel free to put them in the Q&A function if you have any other questions. But we have another question that asks from Ben Pribitok, and the question is, besides offering legal justification and/or delimitation of use of force abroad, isn't there also a related or corollary question of actually shaping tactics on the battlefield, as with targeted drone strikes against key enemy combatants, or even American citizens, as in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki? So I'll turn that over to whoever would like to take a stab at that.
And John, you've been talking about ROE and other related concepts. Do you want to flesh that out a little bit for folks, and Brian and I could pile on if needed?
Sure, thanks, Tess. So I'll specifically look at kind of the drone aspect of it, since you mentioned in your question. There's often a misunderstanding of the use of unmanned vehicles in armed conflict, in that the same rules of engagement or restrictions on the use of force that are sent down sometimes by the president, sometimes at that level, but often by the commander on the ground, that restrict the use that how a individual Marine, soldier, sailor can use force, can use certain weapon systems, can operate in the daytime, at night, can go into a compound, cannot go into a compound. All those things restrict the use of force, and so they're more restrictive than the laws of armed conflict or IHL allow. Specific to drone warfare, those same rules apply. So we don't get a free pass because there aren't boots on the ground somewhere where a drone is operating. And so there's no different rules or anything like that. I think we take more time and care when it comes to unmanned vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles, or on the water, wherever they may be, because often we have the ability to do so. They're more deliberate targets. They're not as dynamic. We can take more time to study the intelligence that we see from those aerial vehicles or from other places, to give us a better picture, which then better allows us to comply with our rules of engagement, our tactical directives, and obviously the laws on conflict.
I'm going to take my prerogative as the moderator and come back to the question of legal reform, because I think it's interesting in a way that it hasn't been for many years, and obviously the reality of 20 years has set in for quite a number of people, and I would appreciate an assessment of where each of you think these efforts might be headed. Whether you think they will produce real results. I mean, obviously there's, efforts for sunrising of authorizations, geographic limitations on greater definition of who the United States is at war with. But all of these are maybe live questions in a way that they haven't been for many years. And so I know we laid out a good number of these recommendations in the report. But just a kind of general reflection on where each of you think those efforts, what's the status of that, and where do you hope that they go in the near future?
Can I start by giving a shout out to Loren's report that she just referenced? Because I think, I hope that we see war powers reform. I hope that we see AUMF reform, but that hope is tempered by a lot of political realities that I think are, it might not be in the short term, to answer your question, that we see those reforms. One of the things I really liked about Loren's report, though, is it talked about the importance of playing small ball with the NDAA, if I'm getting your term right, and using those kinds of incremental reforms, both to build capacity in Congress, build the muscle memory, get information out of the executive branch that the Congress needs to do its job, and sort of build up over time a series of expectations about what that oversight looks like. I think that's crucially important, and it has been going on, and it is continuing, and it should continue more. And we could see some real short-term reforms. But the other bucket that I'm more hopeful for in the short term are the kinds of things that Brian and this report were talking about in where existing authorities within the executive branch could be better policed by the executive branch itself. So one is what he was referring to as 127E, or what used to be 1208 programs. Those could just be overseen better within the executive branch, right? There could be, Washington level, senior level review of some aspects of those that are currently left just within DoD, and even within DoD, within some sort of relatively small cones. I think likewise, the kinds of collective self-defense authorizations, right? The idea that this ancillary self-defense concept means we can designate groups who are eligible for self-defense strikes. Is that really something that should be just within DoD or within an individual combatant command, or could that be elevated to a policy level discussion that also has legal review? So some of these things, I think, are choosing to be more conscious of when these tools that the executive branch already has at its disposal are either delegated down too far or don't have that high level policy review. It's sort of when the only review is it legally available? I think we're already kind of in the wrong place, and bringing these things back up to a more senior strategic policy review would go a long way. I know there's a lot of concerns about micromanaging the use of force and ongoing operations, but look, in places where we don't have boots on the ground, but even where we do, I think we've seen what happens when, as this report explains, mission creep and the facts on the ground mean that we go farther and farther from what was intended. So I would be willing to take the costs of that Washington level management, because I think the benefits are worth it. And those reforms, I think, could happen overnight if the executive branch chose to prioritize them.
I'll add to Tessa's really great points there, and thank you for mentioning the informal powers report that I did with Richard. I think it's really in the executive branch's interest to pursue war powers reform, to pursue AMF reform, and to have a different kind of relationship with Congress. And that may be a tough sell for a lot of folks in this administration, prior administrations, particularly lawyers who have worked really hard to shift the burden from the Congress to the executive branch. But I think there's at least three reasons beyond just good government. One is, I think, that shifting the burden over to Congress, or at least sharing the burden with Congress in terms of overseeing wars, gives us much more legitimacy for our use of force operations, both in terms of the American public as well as overseas. Right now, I mean, it's not at a crisis point at this moment, but it has often been at a crisis point before, where you see civil society, activist groups, advocacy groups, and even our allies and partners talking about the harms that come from U.S. use of force overseas in the ways that we've been talking about in the session today and in the report itself. And when you have that constant questioning of whether or not the United States can be pursuing or should be pursuing force in the way that it is, I think that our adversaries can take a lot of heart in that, and what may be wondering whether or not that such use of force is actually sustainable. I think there's also, kind of related to that, the potential for crisis to leak out, whether actual crisis or perceived crisis, when the United States is not publicly either standing behind, advocating for, or engaging with Congress on use of force. We see this in Syria, we've seen this before in Afghanistan, we've seen this in Yemen and elsewhere, where things that were going on behind the scenes become much more publicly prominent, and a debate happened that should have happened many years ago around a crisis rather than around the overall justification. And then thirdly, I mean, as Tess pointed out in terms of micromanagement, one of the reasons that micromanagement was so prominent in the Obama administration was because so much of it was behind closed doors. So much of it was kept away from Congress or the public. There was a need, I think a well-intended, but maybe not great overall need, to spend more senior leader time on oversight of use of force inside the Situation Room, because so much of it wasn't being debated in public. That took away from time that could have been dedicated to strategy, to Brian's point, to other non-military interventions that may have been more important to the war on terror. And sharing that burden with Congress might work out in the administration's favor to allow them more of that time.
So, whenever someone in the military hears, restrictions on use of force or oversight, of course, we have knee-jerk negative reactions right away, but I hear what, Tess and Loren are saying. It certainly makes some really good points. And as an advisor to commander over the years, right, my main goal is to make sure that the commander had what that commander needed to complete the mission, wherever that mission is, the United States or otherwise, on the battlefield. But I look back to some of the great, timelines and points that Brian made in the report about kind of the evolution, or maybe even lack thereof, of our various approaches to targeting and uses of force from President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, and now, on February 25th, not soon after he took office, President Biden jumped into the fray as well. And while some of the policies changed, the impact on the battlefield was not significant. We all, of course, fear the worst every time there was a change, regardless of what president it was. But in the end, it went back to our ability, as the United States military, to trust our commanders to do their job and to make the right choices. And when I look at some of the recommendations in the report, and I compare them to that evolution that we talked about, and also to the men and women we trust, to use that force, I think that we could stand to relook at how we do some things, because I think we have the men and women, regardless of the mission they get, they will complete that mission, and I think and do it in a way that will comply with whatever restrictions are sent down or not, right? If there are less restrictions or there are different rules, they'll be able to take those and make the right decisions.
Brian, you want to take that on, and maybe also, I know we're short on time, maybe offer any kind of final thoughts you would want to impart to our attendees.
Well, there's so much in the way of insightful comments from Loren and Tess and John to build off of, but I would just like to emphasize one of the points that Loren raised earlier in the discussion, and one of the reasons I'm optimistic for the prospects of war powers reform more broadly, that the politics of war powers reform have changed in Congress, and you are seeing interesting bipartisan coalitions dating back to the work of Senators Sanders and Lee together on Yemen, now with Senators Kaine and Young on repealing the 1991 and 2002 AUMFs. So I think there's important work being done on a bipartisan basis in Congress in this front. Congress is developing the muscle memory, even if to do what Loren terms as the small ball of sort of war powers reform and oversight. And I am optimistic that we're going in the direction that they will take on the heavier and harder task of reforming the 2001 AMF. And I hope that the Biden administration works with Congress and actively engaged with Congress on that task.
Thanks, Brian. And again, I would really commend all of you to have a look at this report. It's on the Crisis Group website, and it came out with a variety of other pieces reflecting on 20 years after 9/11. So I hope all of you have a chance to have a look at that. I just want to thank our speakers. This has been a really great panel. I'm really happy to have been able to bring it together. And to thank our co-sponsors, Just Security and the Reese Center on Law and Security at NYU Law. And thank you all for attending and participating and asking such great questions. And